Welcome to this webinar where we're going to be exploring what are reasonable adjustments and how you can put them into place to support your neurodivergent employee thrive. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand what is neurodivergent. You might have heard of terms such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and not really understand what they mean. But the thing that I want to make explicitly clear is that it is a neurodevelopmental brain difference. They developed in a slightly different way that means that they think, process, and experience the world differently to neurotypical, which is someone who does not have neurodivergence. It is so important to understand that this is not a behaviour choice, certainly not the result of parenting style. It's also important to understand that someone who is neurodivergent actually have multiple conditions. For example, some of the signs and symptoms of ADHD also show up in dyslexia. Some of the examples in combination with autism also show up in ADHD. In the UK, there has been a white paper called the Get Britain Working White Paper, and this came across because there was 2.8 million people a year are economically inactive. What I want to communicate to you is how to move from this idea of recruitment to retention, because we know the cost of recruiting people, getting them confident with the job, really, really high, and the time that takes to lose them to things like burnout is very costly to the company. So how do we look at how we actually retain these individuals? Well, we look at the evidence base, and this session is based on all the research and reading that I have done into the legal documents that underpin this. This includes the EHRC Employment Statutory Code of Practice, the Neuroinclusion at Work report by the CIPD, the Get Britain Working White Paper, and the Buckland Review of Autism Employment. These are what underpins everything that we are talking about, including the Equality Act of 2010. Speaking of the Equality Act 2010, one of the things that is really important to understand is that you do not need a medical diagnosis to put support in place. Now, there is lots of conversation at the moment about the fact that ADHD waiting lists are so long that it's really difficult to get support. You may have employees in your workplace who have been trying to get support for a long time. It is your duty as an employer, if you can reasonably see that an employee is struggling, you are expected to put in reasonable adjustments. The key term that is discussed in the Equality Act is substantial disadvantage. So the experience that the individual is having must have a substantial and long-term disadvantage on their ability to do the job. And this is the wording from the Equality Act. What is also really important to understand is that every individual will have a different profile. So whilst you might meet two individuals who are ADHD or two individuals that are autistic, it does not mean that they experience the world in the same way. And this is what we call a spiky profile. For example, one individual may struggle more with executive function, with planning, prioritising, organisation, and one individual may struggle more with sensory processing, communication. It's really important that we start from a person-centred approach to understand what is best for that individual. This brings us on to what is reasonable. Now, reasonable comes under 3 brackets. It is effective and it is supporting the individual. It is practical and something that can actually be implemented, and it is a reasonable cost. Now, this depends on the employer. For example, if you had an employer that was a large bank and the individual was asking for assistive technology, they would be expected to undertake that cost. However, if it was a small business like a local florist shop where that would actually eat into their profits and have an impact, it would not be deemed as reasonable. Now, when we're talking about cost, often people get reasonable adjustments confused and think that it's things that are really expensive. And usually this isn't actually the case. Most adjustments are free or very, very low cost. There is also a government scheme called Access to Work where they can provide funding to keep people in the workplace who have a long-term disability. This funding can be used for things such as equipment, coaching, and support workers. So we've looked a little bit at the context, and now we need to understand the gap. There's the policy on one side sitting with HR, and there's the individual on this side experiencing the challenges, and then there's you in the middle, the manager. And that's where we need to build your confidence to be able to have these conversations and know how to support people. Too often I hear managers say that they want to help, they have really good intentions, but they just don't know what to say, and they're fearful of saying the wrong thing. But the reality is the cost of unsupported neurodivergence neurodivergence in the UK is £17 billion. So we can't afford to do nothing. And this is where, in this training, I'm going to give you the skills and the confidence to know what to do. Why am I that person to do that? Well, I am an ADHD adult, which means I'm autistic and ADHD. I didn't actually find out this until about 3-4 years ago. Working as a teacher, I was doing training to understand how to support the neurodivergent children, and I recognised a lot of the signs and symptoms in myself, which led me down a journey of discovery. Along this journey, I ended up hitting what's called neurodivergent burnout, and having to leave my role as a leader in education. This then took me on a path of understanding, reading all the literature around this, doing lots of research, and I actually ended up training as an ADHD coach and doing my level 2 in understanding autism. Now I am back in the classroom currently teaching because I have used tools that I'm going to share with you to make real difference in my life and the lives of the clients that I coach. My whole passion is showing people that it's so possible. My whole passion is showing people that it's so possible to thrive with your neurodivergent brain. I call it the brain balance. We're going to support the challenges and learn how to leverage the strengths to make it the best experience for you. And that is what is truly possible for your employees. So let's look at the buckets of adjustment. There are 3 buckets: environmental, procedural, and cultural. When we're looking at environmental, this is things such as sensory inputs, lighting, noise, location of where they're working. And things we could do in this section is we could provide them with loop earplugs, which are fantastic little in-ears that filter out a lot of the noise. An employee could ask to wear noise-cancelling headphones, which can help them with focus. It could be tinted glasses because the lights are too bright. It could be access to breakout spaces where they can go for some decompression. And it could be things like movement breaks. For someone who is neurodivergent, in particular ADHD, movement breaks can be incredibly helpful for focus and incredibly helpful for well-being across the day. This means that they could, instead of taking a 30-minute lunch break, they could have 2 15-minute breaks, which would be more helpful for them to have chunks throughout the day. It's really important to understand that all of these are built in collaboration with the individual. The next one is procedural, and this is things such as flexible hours, communication channels, and meeting formats. So when we look at some adjustments here, we could look at recording meetings for the transcripts and using AI bullet points to get the key notes out. This supports with executive function, and this helps individuals to be able to remember what are the tasks they need to do or remember what's being discussed. It could be things such as walking meetings, because the pressure of walking next to someone is massively reduced and allows them to then be able to access the part of their brain that is creative, the part of their brain that is able to problem solve. It could also be shorter meetings for transition times. So often I see individuals who have back-to-back meetings for 3 hours with no transition time, and by the end of the last meeting they're really struggling. If the meeting is turned to 50 minutes instead of an hour, that gives a 10-minute transition time to go to the bathroom, time to go and get a drink, etc. It breaks it up so it's not as cognitively overwhelming. The next one is things which are cultural, and these are things such as patience, understanding the directness of someone's conversation, normalizing fidgeting, cameras off for meetings. And some examples of adjustments you could make in this section are clear expectations, clear deadlines, normalizing communication styles. So you will find sometimes, particularly with individuals who are autistic, they may be very blunt in their communication and very to the point, which to some people may come across as rude, but to the individual, it's making sure that they're getting the point across in the most logical way forward. It can also be normalizing things such as stims. So some individual will self-soothe via movements or vocal stims, and normalizing things such as eye contact expectations. So are you explicitly saying to the individual that it's okay if they feel uncomfortable with making eye contact? In the toolkit that I'm going to send out, I've listed so many of these and examples of the adjustments and the buckets that they fall under and how it can actually support the employee. Now, it's important to understand how we get to the root cause of what is the challenge and what is the outcome that's going to be the most helpful. And to do this, we use task, need, and outcome. Task: what is the thing that you are asking them to actually do? need, what is the cognitive or sensory barrier preventing it. I like to call this, what is the friction? And the outcome, what is the thing that bridges that gap and is the thing that is going to make the difference? So what I want you to do is I'd like you to pause this here and think about, what is one task that an employee of yours is currently struggling with? What could the underlying need or friction be? What is a challenge that that individual may be experiencing? Because we're now going to map this forward and look at how could we use this to identify the outcomes, and you'd be doing this in a collaborative conversation, and I'm going to show you how you would set that up. So here's the case study. This case study is for someone who is struggling to focus and manage their deadlines. So the task is to complete a long or complex report. The need is that the individual doesn't know where to start. They struggle with time blindness, which is the passing of time, and they have challenges with reading and writing. The outcome could be that you sit down with the individual and you agree collaborative chunking. This is where you look at, this is the report that needs doing, and we have section A, section B, section C. I would like you to do section A by this week, section C by this deadline. Having that clear structure and accountability supports the individual to manage that project. It also creates check-ins where if the individual is finding it difficult, they know they'll be able to ask for support. Whenever you're doing any of these things, it's really important that the individual has autonomy. You cannot impose reasonable adjustments onto someone. They have to be collaboratively created because the person needs to have that autonomy. In terms of challenges with reading and writing, we can also include assistive technology here. And this is things such as text-to-speech, task managers, AI assistants, which can be incredibly helpful. This case study is exploring communication and ambiguity. So often I see individuals are struggling because they have gone into a meeting and a verbal request has been given to send follow-up documents or complete a task. And in the moment, the individual may not be able to process that because of auditory processing challenges. They may have challenges with working memory and remembering to capture that information. How do they capture that information? And then because of that, they may forget. And when people forget, what often can happen is there can be a psychological safety element where they can feel fearful of asking for help because of how it makes them look and how they may be perceived as someone who's lazy, doesn't listen, or isn't able to take instructions. And this then means that the individual isn't willing to then ask for help, so they continue with the ambiguity and uncertainty, which often leads to mistakes in work or missed deadlines. So the outcomes and adjustments that we can create here is introducing the receipt rule. So this is where all meetings could be transcribed using an AI tool. For example, this meeting is on Google Meet and I have transcribed it using Gemini. Gemini is then going to give me a transcription, it's going to give me a recording, and it's also going to give me a bullet point list of actions that need to be undertaken. This can be incredibly helpful because it's not adding to anyone's workload. Then we're going to look at explicit parameters. So if it's a verbal request, often I hear people say, get that to me ASAP. What does ASAP mean? An individual, for example, with autism needs very clear deadlines. So rather than saying ASAP, you could replace it with, get this to me by Thursday at 2:00. That is a clear deadline that they know where they stand and they're able to work around it to meet that deadline. Whereas ASAP puts a lot of pressure on them. So how do we actually have that conversation? Well, we don't assume. As said at the beginning of this session, what works for one neurodivergent person might not actually work for another that well. We're going to co-construct the solution together, ensuring that the individual has the autonomy and has the ability to say what works best for them. And then we're going to do a trial and review. Now, not every adjustment is going to work first time. It may be that there needs a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of collaboration to make it the best fit. That doesn't mean that it's failed. What's important to understand is that a neurodivergent individual has received 20,000 more pieces of negative feedback by the time they are 11. So often what will happen is the individual will take that and make it about themselves, thinking that they are the bad person, they're not good enough. So we need to have this trial and review where it's safe for the individual to explore and find what works for them. But what do we do if we end up with this conversation? The individual has come with a disclosure saying they're struggling, or something has been raised that they are awaiting an ADHD autism assessment, or they're disclosing a recruitment questionnaire that they've got a neurodivergence. And the manager, very well intentioned, says, so what would help? And the employee says, I don't know, nothing works. It's important to understand that this is the employee's experience, that they have internalized that nothing works for them because they've been told that they're bad, they've been told that they're broken, that they're lazy. So this requires a little bit more unpicking and asking some clever questions. So we're going to go back to the task, need, or the outcome. I've given you some examples of some questions here that you could ask to unpick and help the individual have that reflection about what would actually work for them. It's important to understand as well that some neurodivergent individuals find that introspection really hard without having these questions. Just asking them, well, what works, can be really difficult for them to identify. I've also given you some here about the outcome, so looking at what's worked well in the past and starting to understand and unpick that together. Remember, all of this is an open and collaborative conversation. It should be a two-way street. I thought it was important to touch on assistive technology because these can be incredibly helpful for individuals. So I've given you some examples here of assistive technology that I use myself, that I've used with clients that have been really helpful. Goblin tools can break tasks down into micro chunks, which can help with getting started. ChatGPT or other AI software such as Gemini, Claude can be incredibly helpful with providing structures for reports, for tasks, etc. Speechify is a text-to-speech tool which allows you to read documents. This can be incredibly helpful for people who get visual fatigue. Whisperflow is my personal favourite because it will take your voice and it will auto-transcribe and it will auto-punctuate and correct any grammar, removing things like ums, ands, or filler words. And Flow Savvy, which is incredibly helpful for task management. And Flow Savvy you put all your tasks in, you put your time blocks in when you're available to work, and it will auto schedule based on your deadlines and your capacity. If you miss it, it will reschedule your calendar, acting a little bit like a personal assistant. And I've given you an example here of how this would actually work in a realistic workflow. So report writing, client notes, the individual needs to do that. So they use ChatGPT to create a standard performer. They use Goblin to break down the task, and then they use speech to text tools to write, and then text to speech to listen through and check for the flow. So we've been through a lot there. We've looked at the policy, we've looked at the individual, we've looked at how we can support you, but actually we need the real tools to move forward with this. And that's why I've created the CREATE framework. Now, C is for connect. You're going to model together, identifying what works best for your brain. So I always say that managers should show that they're doing this too. It shouldn't always just be on the employee. Actually building a culture of understanding what works best for your brain is fantastic. I also say that these tools don't just work for neurodivergent individuals, they work for every brain. We're going to review, so we're going to audit the existing workflows and the environments, including the sensory and the processes. We're going to embed, so this is making what works best for our brains the norm, and that's why we're talking about that culture change. We're going to adapt because, as we mentioned, the tools may not work forever. They may need an adaptation phase where we can tweak this a little bit. Then we're going to train. We're going to look at the whole team, understanding what is equity versus equality and giving people the tools to be able to do the best job. And then evolve, understanding what job crafting is to get the best out of that neurodivergent individual. What I've done is I've made a complete manager's toolkit with all the templates, all the scripts that you may need. In module 1, we've got conversation scripts and roadmaps to what a collaborative conversation looks like. In module 2, we've got implementation templates and all the tools that you need to do this, including adjustments forms. In module 3, I've given you adjustment menus and an assistive tech guide. And in module 4, I've given you the condition guides and the legal checklist. So this is giving you the key information from those reports that I told you about at the start of this call. Now, this toolkit is currently available on my website if you scan the QR code. Because you have attended this training, there is a discount code Neuro20 to get 20% off. Managers say that I want to help, but when I ask the employee what they need, they say they just don't know. In the toolkit, I've given you an example of what an employee might be saying and what could be the potential issue. This allows you to craft your questions more carefully and make suggestions that you can collaborate on together. If you agree to an adjustment, is it set in stone forever? Absolutely not. It should be a process of evolving and working collaboratively to find out what works best for you and the employee. My team is mostly hybrid or remote. Is this toolkit just for physical office spaces? Absolutely not. This is even more important to support the individuals who are not in the office every day, because when you're not in the office, you sometimes miss out on those corridor conversations, which is where individuals will be disclosing that they're finding things hard or that they're needing additional support. So this provides you with a way to be checking in on them and supporting them, even if you are not in the same location. And isn't this HR's job? Why is it me as a manager to figure this out? So it is a collaboration across the whole organization. It's really important to understand that managers, HR, and employee work together. It's not a one against the other kind of mentality. It's also important to understand that the legal background is that if an individual was to disclose to HR that they were neurodivergent or they were struggling, the HR is reasonably expected to have a conversation about what support can be put in place. If this was to go to tribunal because the individual wasn't getting the support, the tribunal would be in favour of the employee because the HR, which is the employer, did know about the neurodivergence. So if you're interested in that, you can scan the QR code to get that. If you'd like to ask any further questions or inquire about further training, please do just send me an email. Thank you for watching.